Thank you for listening to Mormon Sex Info. This episode is an archived episode and is only now becoming publicly available. Mormon Sex Info relies on contributions. To contribute, please visit mormonsex.info. And now, please enjoy this episode.
Hello and welcome to Mormon Sex Info. This is Natasha Helfer Parker. Today, I am so pleased to have Paul Malan with me to talk.
Stop because it's Malan.
Malan? How have I been saying Malan for however many years?
I think my ancestors said Malan. We just changed it when we got to America. Because, Americans are like that. Take two.
Hello, this is Natasha Helfer Parker, and this is Mormon Sex Info. So happy to be with you today and to have with me Paul Malan, who back in 2015 wrote a great piece that has made quite a bit of rounds on the internet. It's called The Naked People in Your iPod. And he comes from Mormon background, and I'm super excited to interview him about this. And just want to give you a minute, Paul, to introduce yourself to us. What do you do in your regular life when you're not writing great pieces about sex and pornography?
Most of my time is spent parenting. I have 5 kids.
Oh, wow.
That takes
What age ranges do they? Yeah, what age ranges do they go?
My youngest is 8 and my oldest is 16. And pretty much every 2 years, got a nice little schedule and kept with it. So,
okay.
Yep, it takes a lot of our time. I do work. I write mostly for work. I'm in marketing. So I create videos and things like that as well.
Okay, great. So, and this was in 2015 then when you came up with this piece. Why don't you talk a little bit about your initial motivators for writing it? And then you've also put your voice to it, which I'm really pleased that we're going to be including that as part of this video. So you'll be able to listeners will be able to hear you actually read this aloud and a few things that you've added as well.
Yeah. The motivation was, with 5 kids and a lot of energy around that topic. Pornography is very scary and didn't go well for me growing up. It was like a pretty weighty issue. And so I thought I wanted to kind of demystify it because it bothered me to hear all the other influences that were influencing my son at the time. And it just didn't seem productive. And so I was wondering, well, what would be more productive? And I started thinking about it, and that kind of consumed my, my shower time and my bike rides and everything, my spare time for a while, till I decided I could write a letter to him that would try to explain it in a way that maybe, I'm better writing than I am talking. So that's true when I'm parenting too. So it's not the only letter I've written to my kids. There's a bunch, but yeah, that's kind of where it came from.
Okay. Maybe we'll have access to some of those later on too.
If I ever finish them.
Well, yeah.
Yeah.
So you mentioned that it didn't really go well for you growing up. I'm assuming you grew up Mormon. Do you want to talk a little bit about maybe some of the messages that you received around this topic and how it affected you?
Yeah, sure. I did grow up Mormon. My dad was a Boyd K. Packer style Mormon. So there was always one right way. They had great intentions, great people. I love them, and they loved me quite a bit. But their messaging around sex and sexuality was very not productive, And I'm grateful that I'm parenting now, because parenting then, I think, without the resources we have and it's so easy to learn more about effective ways of parenting, effective messaging based on research and not superstition or fear. So they did their best, but it was pretty, when I was, the first time I got a girlfriend, their message was, you have no idea how powerful sex is. You should really, they made it this big, big monster instead of just being like it's just, this is how you deal with it. It's going to happen like this. And then you'll have feelings like this. It just felt like they made it into something to be afraid of, which when you're 14 and you've got a girlfriend like that, all that does is make you more curious, right? I think it just encourages foolish behavior to add negative energy to scary topics.
Yeah. Yeah. Not a lot of, the research shows that we haven't done really well with teaching teens through fear-based tactics, whether it's about porn or drunk driving or, it's just not really a very effective way to get the results that we want. So
yeah,
sounds like that was your experience. That was my experience as well. Well, before we go forward then with the interview, what I'd like to do is have the listeners listen to this audio piece that you've produced that is just kind of a really interesting read and listen, and it goes for about 10 minutes. So we'll go to that.
The first time you saw them, by accident, you were too young to feel embarrassed. You came wondering how a search for cats could have gone so badly. I answered all your questions and hoped that you couldn't tell that I actually was a little embarrassed. We've both grown up since then and talked a lot about them, hoping to make the naked people in your iPod just another thing in your world, like jealousy in school, blood in video games, and sugar in soda. You're older now, more likely to find them on purpose, and less likely to talk to me about them when you do. So, while I still have your attention, before you're too old to hug me in front of your friends, let's talk some more about pornography. But first, let's talk about bacon. Every day, you feel hungry. It's not something you choose, it's just part of being alive. It's physiology. When you feel hungry, you get to decide what to do about it. You could skip a meal, steal a Snickers bar from the corner store, or order some breakfast from a restaurant. That is morality. Since you're being raised Mormon, you probably wouldn't order coffee with your breakfast. You don't have it so bad. If we were Jewish, you might never have even tasted bacon. Every culture has shared values like this that reinforce its collective identity. As a shortcut, let's call this religion. Just like your appetite reacts to the smell of cooking bacon, evolution wired clever primates, like you and me, to react to sexual stories, pictures, and videos. It's that simple. That's pretty much the only reason porn is a thing. But for some people, porn isn't just a thing, it's a very scary thing. In our culture, a lot of the people in the very scary thing camp spend their Sunday afternoons in the same building we do. Now, don't make too much of this. I think religions do some things really well. But conservative religions like ours suck at porn.
Pornography is any picture or narrative that feeds the carnal man within.
And young women, please understand that if you dress immodestly, you are magnifying this problem by becoming pornography.
That was Elder Callister and Elder Oaks, doing their best to make conversations about porn more confusing. They just told you and your friends and your local church leaders that anything that turns you on is pornographic, including the people around you. So if porn is a problem, and being aroused is porn, what are they telling us? Arousal is a problem. They're just wrong. They're confusing morality and physiology. Think about what it would mean if we applied the same logic to our appetite. Instead of deciding what to eat without bacon, we would be worried that being hungry is a problem. How could we have a healthy relationship with food if we believe that? Getting turned on is not a problem. Getting turned on is physiology. What we choose to do about being turned on is morality. And whether our choices align with our cultural values is religion. If you can keep those three ideas straight, pornography and sexuality in general will become a lot less complicated. You can tell I don't love the way our conservative culture talks about porn, but I am definitely not a fan of it. That's part of what makes it so frustrating. There are plenty of practical reasons you might choose to avoid porn. The porn industry tends to exploit its performers. It depicts women in particular as mere objects for sexual gratification. It distorts reality, messes up our expectations, and wastes a lot of time. But if we apply the label pornography to anything that excites any person, we give up the ability to talk about it in a meaningful way. If your youth group leader tells you bare shoulders and bikinis at the beach are pornographic, you're going to get confused. When I talk to you about pornography, I mean pictures and videos of sex. I mean the business of exploiting our hardwired response to sexuality, producing pictures and videos that reduce sexual relationships to a series of camera-friendly stunts. There's this iconic car chase scene in the movie The Italian Job where Mark Wahlberg and his friends race Mini Coopers across a crowded city. They dart in and out of traffic, shoot down concrete steps into the subway. They even jump their cars out of a tunnel into the Los Angeles River. You're not old enough to drive, but you've been riding in cars since you were 2 days old, so you understand the fantasy of a great car chase movie. It's fun to imagine, but you know it isn't what driving in a crowded city is really like. You don't have that kind of context when you watch pornography. You don't have any way of understanding if what you're watching is what healthy relationships are really like, or if it's the sexual equivalent of a Mini Cooper racing through a subway station. Ideally, our culture would help you gain that perspective. But porn makes us so uncomfortable, we end up making it harder, not easier, for you to understand. Hey mom, you might say, I watched a movie last night. Would it really work to drive a car in the subway? That's an easy question to ask. How about this one? Hey mom, I watched some porn last night. Does sex really end like that? Not such an easy question. Why is that? Maybe it's because sexuality makes just about everyone anxious. There's a lot of natural curiosity, physical motivation, and cultural baggage. We don't usually ask our parents questions about porn because we're ashamed of what we know and confused by what we don't. Too often, people condemning porn use fear to get their message out there. They call pornography the new drug and frame it as if it were more damaging than alcoholism and more addictive than heroin. They mean well, but their message, looking at porn dooms you to a life of crippling addiction and miserable loneliness, is unproductive. It gives pornography more power than it needs to have. They have made pornography the enemy, the representation of everything wrong about human sexuality. If you've seen it, you're damaged goods. And if you didn't hate seeing it, you're probably an addict already. You should feel terrible. But that's just not true. Pornography is not the enemy. Shame is the enemy. Shame is fear personalized. If they knew this about me, they would reject me. Fear of rejection feeds shame, and shame feeds pornography. And giving people reasons to be afraid of porn makes it all worse, not better. By the way, don't confuse shame and guilt. Guilt is healthy. It tells you, something I did is not okay. Shame is destructive. It wants you to say, I am not okay. And when things don't feel okay, we try to replace the bad feeling with something else. It's called self-soothing, and we all do it. Some people run 5 miles. Some people eat a pint of ice cream or watch Netflix for hours. Some people drink wine or shop or stare at their cell phone or sleep or take drugs or read or play video games. And some people look at porn. Most of the time, a 5-mile run is just a 5-mile run. An ice cream is just ice cream. But when we're trying to escape that shame, the I am not okay feeling, the motivation a person feels to escape into pornography isn't much different from the motivation her friend feels to escape into a pint of ice cream, which isn't much different from his neighbor's motivation to escape into a 5-mile run. Humans have a remarkably counterproductive habit of trying to numb shame by going back to the thing that triggered our shame in the first place. If I'm feeling bad about myself for looking at porn, I'm likely to bury the feeling by looking for more porn. It can create an unhealthy cycle that acts like addiction. Of course, there isn't anything wrong with self-soothing. In fact, it's an important part of mental health. The trick is finding coping mechanisms that are productive instead of destructive. So how can we learn to do it well? My suggestion is going to seem familiar because it starts with the same 2 words I tell you all the time. Ask why. Why are you reaching for that ice cream? Why are you staring at your phone instead of interacting with the real world? Why are you about to go incognito in your web browser? It takes courage and practice, but if you follow your answers to their root, they can help you understand what you're really after. Sometimes I eat ice cream because I like ice cream, and sometimes I eat ice cream because I feel like I was a lousy parent that day. That doesn't have to mean I shouldn't eat the ice cream. It isn't a matter of should or shouldn't. It's simply a matter of awareness. It isn't going to kill me to eat some ice cream after a hard day, but it isn't going to teach me anything either, unless I'm aware of why I'm eating it. Once I am aware, I get to make a choice. I can choose to respond to life on purpose, instead of reacting to life out of habit. Try it, not as a way of talking yourself out of anything, just as a way of practicing awareness. Next time you catch yourself killing time on your phone, or looking for porn, or chasing after some escape that feels heavy, ask why. Sometimes you'll realize you're looking for porn because you're hiding from a negative emotion like shame or embarrassment or frustration. When you realize that, ask yourself, is looking at porn going to make this better? Other times, you'll realize you're just looking for porn because you're horny. Sorry, my dad used the word horny one time in front of my friends and I nearly died from embarrassment. There's nothing too complicated about that motivation, but it does still present a moral choice. If you found out your favorite bakery was dumping harmful chemicals into a community park, what would you do? The more donuts they sell, the more damage they do to your community. Would you still buy their donuts? What if you waited until the end of the day when they give away old donuts for free? Would it feel like you weren't part of the problem because no money changed hands? It's a sloppy comparison, I know, but there are real downsides to pornography as a business. Whether we pay for it or not, watching porn creates demand in the market and perpetuates some pretty damaging dynamics. While you're deciding if porn aligns with your moral compass, do some research about the way it impacts the people who work in the business. Conservative culture tries to make it scarier than it needs to be, but ultimately porn is just another thing in your world. I know you're going to bump into it sometimes, and I wish I could tell you exactly the right way to blend your physiology, morality, and religion. It's something you have to decide for yourself. Sometimes you'll handle it well, and sometimes you'll act in ways that don't line up with who you really are. When that happens, learn from the guilt, but don't buy into the shame. You are a clever primate, and you are wired to get turned on by porn. That's just part of being alive. But that doesn't mean porn makes your world a better place, and it doesn't mean porn will help you feel connected to others. And that's really what a meaningful life is about.
Okay, so we're back. That was so great, Paul. I mean, really, I'm just so impressed with the scope and the content of this piece, given that you're not a mental health professional and or a sex therapist, but you took such a sex positive approach to this. I guess the first question I have is, how in the heck did you come up with so many of these ideas? Did you do a lot of your own research? Was this kind of just something that came from your heart? Like, what was the process of you even coming up with a lot of this information to begin with?
I don't really know. I can't remember how it all came together. I'm a firm believer there's nothing new in the world, right? I mean, any idea I think I have, I got it from somebody else, I'm sure. Like maybe there's a combination of different people and ideas in there, but I like to read, I like to study. I would guess it's probably a combination of several different people. I do know when I shared it and put it up there, I was really nervous. In fact, you and a few other sex therapists contacted me and said, "That's great, good job." And it was an enormous relief because I'm not trained. I have no idea what I'm talking about. I'm just a dad, in fact, stumbling through parenting like anybody else. So it was very validating, very reassuring to hear from people like you to say that you're right on line. So it just could equally have been received with a lot of thumbs down, boo, you're an idiot, right? Because we all think we're right about our opinions. It's just, you never really know what's going to be productive with your kids and things.
Well, I'll give you a little bit more credit than that. You actually reached out to me, I think, either right before or right after you published it and asked for my opinion. So I think that was really, that says a lot, when you're wanting, I guess, some feedback on a piece like this that you've done. And you're right. I actually did like it very much. And I think helped you share it or spread it or something along those lines, because I've used it ever since as a resource. And I do know other sex therapists who I wouldn't have known at the time who have mentioned this and who don't come from a Mormon background, right? So they wouldn't be in our normal circles. So they've had access to this as well and use it. So yeah, it's gotten some national attention for sure, and has been received very positively by at least the sex therapy field.
Yeah, I think it's actually referenced in a book by David Lay. One of my friends read the book and said, "Hey, did you know that?"
Yeah.
So that was kind of fun.
Yeah, super great. And Marty Klein, I think, mentions it as well. I'm not sure in a book, but he came up with a porn checklist, like a literacy checklist for kids. It's kind of a nice way to kind of go through and talk about some things with kids. And I've heard him mention your piece as well. So yeah, very, very prominent sex therapists in the United States right now. So let's go through some of this, of what you talk about. First of all, I love the fact that you bring in metaphors. You start with bacon, you've got a bacon metaphor, you've got a driving metaphor. And so that really kind of, I think, helps put sexuality into more of a normal day-to-day life perspective, because I do think it's interesting how we can do a lot of this navigation with other things like eating or exercise or watching TV. But when it comes to sex, it just becomes so much more difficult to talk about. And so you do a really good job of normalizing it from the get-go just by using some of these metaphors. You want to talk a little bit about how that makes it maybe easier as a parent to use metaphors?
Yeah. What's weird, I think in metaphor all the time. Well, I think it's just, I don't know if I'm more than most people or not. I'm known for it around work, and my kids, I think, tire of it. I have one son in particular who's very, he doesn't like metaphor. He likes just straight information. And as he gets older, he's now 14. And he frequently will just stop me and say, "Okay, we're not talking about a boat. Can you talk?" because I'll try to explain to him why I care enough to intervene in something, right? And he'll
right.
put the brakes on and say, Dad, can you just talk about what we're talking about? I don't care about your stories and your like, it's been that way since before he even knew what a metaphor meant, but he definitely it doesn't resonate with him as well. But I think they're tremendously powerful. To put anything in the form of a story, like, just triggers that part of our brain where we're willing to go along for the ride and like pay attention, and then decide what resonates and what doesn't. It's easier in a story, especially if it creates distance between an emotional subject and the people who are talking.
Well, and you bring up a very good point in that, and I'm sure you know this with 5 kiddos, but what works with one kid doesn't work with another, right? And so you think you're doing a parenting win, and you come up with this whole strategy and thing that works with one, and then kind of got to start from scratch with the other one. Right. So so having to be flexible, right? And use these types of, even using something like this resource that you've provided us in different ways with whichever kid you have. So you talk about how, we kind of suck at talking about porn, and you have some excerpts, from Elder Callister and Elder Oaks. And do you mind me asking if you're still an active member? Are your kids going to church? Are they part of the Young Men's, Young Women's programs?
I do not attend. I haven't gone in several years. My family, I would say, still are Mormon. My wife is not traditional, but she attends, regularly, not all the time. We give the kids the choice around the age of 12 to begin choosing. I don't actually mind if they go or don't go. What I am concerned by is whether or not they're doing it on purpose, because it's super easy to opt out of anything, church or swimming or track club or anything that takes effort. The easy way is always just to say, yeah, I'll pass. I'll stay home and play video games, or I'll go do something else that's more fun. And so they get a little frustrated, our kids, because for my wife, it still feels like a connection that she wants them to have. For me, I just want them to choose on purpose, one way or the other. And so instead of just saying, hey, you're 12, do you want to go to church today? Yes or no? We kind of, ask harder questions and make them, hopefully help them understand what they're giving up and what they're choosing and the consequences. So my daughter is 12 and she's still attending. And I think she's more likely to stick around because there's a great social circle. Her friends are there, great leaders. The boys, my older 2 boys, aren't interested.
Okay. Well, and the reason I ask that is to understand, kind of what your thumbprint is on, having, not thumbprint, what the, being able to take the pulse, right, of what the current kind of rhetoric is around pornography. And one thing that I've noticed, over the last probably 15 years, is obviously the internet and things have become more accessible for kids, especially using smartphones and stuff, is that the rhetoric has gotten more, we talk about pornography more often than I ever remember talking about pornography when I was a teen. And that the fear rhetoric is up, so some of these comments that you spoke, that you kind of picked out of the many that you could have picked out from that talk about pornography, it is very fear driven. It's very, what I say, it uses provocative language, emotional language, right? So that it's kind of meant to bring up all these emotions. I remember Callister talking, for example, about octopus tentacles, and it's very visually and emotionally rich in how some of these things are presented. And so I just wondered if, in talking to your kids, if they've noticed those things, what their opinions are about how the leaders talk about porn. Do you have any information from your kids on that type of topic?
Yeah, it mostly, I think, annoys them. Metaphor works both ways. You can use it well or poorly. And this is one of the things that's hard as a parent, is that you don't necessarily want your child to choose something that's not productive. But often the productive choice is easier to come by if they're not afraid of it, if there's no pressure. So especially as my kids get older, one of the biggest things I try to do is remove pressure from their choices so they can see more clearly what it is they're choosing. And I feel like when you start talking about, octopuses leading you down to hell, that's not removing pressure, that's adding pressure. Very frustrating for me to have those kind of voices in their head and then to come home and try to reconcile that. And I'm sure I don't do a great job at it, but we have to talk about those things because otherwise they accept some pretty, it just doesn't make sense to me to take that approach with anything.
Yeah. And when it comes to this particular topic, especially since you sound like you're in somewhat of a mixed faith marriage, type of scenario? Are you and your wife fairly unified on this, or does she have different opinions?
Yeah, my wife and I on this topic especially agree. She had a different upbringing than I did. Her parents were more reasonable, less fear-based with it, but she just doesn't see it being a productive thing to push them with fear or manipulation. One of the big things my kids have said, to answer your question, when they come home from a lesson or a meeting or something that talks a lot about this in a fear-based way, they know kids who do this kind of thing all the time. And the same is true of drugs and anything else, right? Mm-hmm. If we lead with fear when we're talking about something like porn or marijuana or something, these kids have lots of examples, counterexamples. They'll say, you say it's going to destroy my life. That kid over there is the fastest kid on the team and he smokes more than I ever would, Mm-hmm. So you can't lead with fear and still expect to have trust from your child. And if you're the leader, especially higher as you get higher and higher, how does that not erode trust in the people who are looking to you for leadership when there are counterexamples everywhere they look, unless they disclose their mind, which is more horrifying than most things kids could choose, I think.
That's an excellent point. It's interesting when I talk to adults, of course, who are then telling me about their adolescence and their backgrounds with these kinds of issues. It's always interesting to me how many people are not in my office, right? So when I think about all the people who maybe had the capacity, like you're saying, to either roll their eyes at their leaders or kind of, do the typical thing that teens do, like, they don't know what they're talking about, or that's so over exaggerated. Those are not usually the people that are in my office. The people that are in my office are those that maybe had a tendency towards anxiety, had a tendency towards depression anyway, even before these messages kind of came to be, or these messages exacerbated those kinds of tendencies. So, what comes first, the chicken or the egg? And so they took these messages really seriously. And so now there was like a habitual confession type of pattern that started from a very early age, or the secrecy pattern, so because it's not safe and because I'm afraid of the consequences and I better not tell anybody. So very isolating type of responses. So I guess what I just want to add to your comment. So I agree that a lot of kids will just like roll their eyes at us and say, this is stupid. You're stupid. It's kind of normal for kids to do that anyway at this age. But then for the kids where they don't do that, it's also harmful because they're taking it so seriously and they're believing the rhetoric so deeply that it affects their identity, it affects their choices, it affects their self-esteem, and it affects future relationships because they're developing these patterns of relational distress from a very early age.
I can definitely see that.
So right away, one of the things that I really like is that you really normalize arousal. And you really counter this idea that anything that's arousing is going to be considered pornography, because then, we walk around the world with a really kind of weird way of looking at things. And it completely decimates the legitimacy of human sexuality as a thing, right? Which I think we start noticing at puberty. So you say getting turned on is not the problem, and that getting turned on is actually part of physiology. So do you want to share a little bit of your thoughts about that, what it's been like to normalize that for your kids? The idea that arousal is okay, the idea that we're going to be turned on, the idea that we're going to be curious, that these are actually like, if kids aren't experiencing those things, then I have other concerns kind of idea.
Right. I think there's a TED Talk. I'm sure you've probably seen it. It's a guy who says we need a new metaphor for sexual relationships or something, converting it to pizza instead of the old.
Yes, that's Al Vernacchio, and he's been on this show actually. So yeah. So
I love that idea. I love the idea of making it something that's like pizza, because there's so many layers to that idea. You can be in the mood for pizza or not. You can like red sauce or pesto sauce or chicken or pepperoni. Like there's so many different ways to spin that. And there are people who don't like pizza, and that's perfectly fine. And there are people who like gluten-free crust, although I can't imagine. There are things like that. And if you just turn it into something that is very human, hunger, we all experience it. How could you, I still think there's so much shame. There's so much messaging out there that it'll complicate things. But if that really is the way you learn to see your sexuality, it's just like sometimes you're in the mood for something and sometimes you're not. And sometimes you'll understand that your friends like something that you don't, and it's okay. You don't have to label it and label them and then carry around an idea in your heads we always get surprised when our ideas of what's normal get violated, whether it's sexuality or anything. Why bother carrying around the weight of self-righteousness, or feeling like you've got it sorted out because your dad told you when you were 11 what's okay and what's not okay. And then eventually you're going to either come across a change in yourself or in somebody that you respect. That doesn't have to be a conflict. Just go with it. Like, you like pizza? Oh, that's nice. I like pasta. It's fine. Mm-hmm. It's just food. It's just a way of dealing with hunger and being alive. It's just part of being who we are.
Yeah, no, I think that's great. With the Strength of Youth pamphlet, one of my concerns with it is that it really makes it almost to the point where you have to, in order to be worthy, you really have to fall under some type of like asexual orientation type of qualification, which, I mean, I guess if you're asexual, that's fine, but most people are not asexual. And so because it really condemns a sexual arousal, sexual thought, and so even the concepts of thinking about your sexuality being turned on is vilified. And I just think that's so unrealistic and sets everybody or most people up for failure.
Especially impacts my daughter in different ways than my sons. That's been a surprise to me. I wish that I were super enlightened as a younger person and had this all figured out, but I'm learning as I go just by seeing things. I have empathy more strongly for my wife and my daughter, whether I ought to or not. Maybe I'm one of those super men who gets it by nature or something, but watching my daughter grow up and hear messages like that, like the messaging in the Strength of Youth about what you should and shouldn't feel. First of all, I hate the idea that she's learning that the way she dresses is a catalyst for somebody else's sin. She's only 12. And at 10 years old, she was already telling me that she couldn't wear certain dresses because you could see her shoulders. And, like the tankini she wore was like not modest anymore because it was a little bit small and you could see a little bit of skin, like that. That messaging is so harmful. I'm watching my daughter interact with that world, feeling like, on one hand, I'm a man and my two oldest are boys. So that seemed like, okay, I kind of get this. I feel like I can swim in the same water. And now I'm watching it through somebody else's eyes. I'm thinking for the first time, oh my gosh, this really is more messed up than I had thought. We have so much conflicting messaging for young women, young men as they're growing up about what it means to be modest or to be sexual or not, to feel sexual things or not. This doesn't seem to make sense.
Yeah, you're hitting on a whole nother topic, right? The modesty rhetoric that's so difficult and harmful. I think people don't realize that objectification goes both ways, so you can use obviously sexuality and body image and all that. And we definitely objectify women and men, but our culture definitely likes to look at women. I often note that both men's magazines and women's magazines have women on the cover. So, but men get objectified as well in different ways. And even the term objectification is complex because it is something. At some level, objectification is a way that our brain organizes data. So it's not always necessarily bad, but in the ways that, where you really see the value of somebody or kind of organize the value of a person through the way they look, is a form of objectification that I think we're talking about. But that goes both ways. Whether you uncover a person or cover a person, you're still objectifying the person by what they're wearing. And I think a lot of times we don't recognize that. We think we're being protective by having these expectations that women in particular wear certain clothing or that certain body parts being exposed is going to mean certain things. And this, again, to your point, doesn't really work because it's pretty easy to see cultures, the Muslim countries, for example, where pretty much the entire body is covered and, you can still have sexual thoughts when you see an ankle. I mean, you don't have to go that far even in our own culture to see those stories, right? Where an ankle was quite the exciting thing, back even in the Victorian era or back in Puritan American, right? It's culture. And so it versus just being body comfortable and teaching our children to be comfortable with bodies. And if there is sexual arousal, that can happen whether somebody's completely covered or not. And that it also can be a learning opportunity to learn how to deal with that arousal instead of just pretending that arousal isn't going to be there regardless. So we really do miss a lot of steps when we think that modesty is somehow, if everybody's wearing a certain thing at church, then nobody's going to be aroused and we're all okay and we don't have to deal with sexuality. That's just it's a big misnomer anyway. Not to mention that people don't just go to church. So I don't know why parents are so upset when kids might see, especially boys, might see a girl dressed a certain way at church when they're probably seeing girls dressed in those ways all over the place, in their day-to-day world at school or in the media or things. And I cringe when I hear these stories that, a girl was approached by a parent, a mother of a son, and with some type of statement like, you're making it difficult for my son. I mean, those stories are just, that's abusive. That's just inappropriate and not good boundaries. And we have a lot of issues to work through in these types of stories.
Right. I remember when I was younger, we had younger kids, and I remember thinking, I wish I could believe that we're effective. Because, man,
it'd be so easy. Right.
You just I was one time watching a movie with friends, and we had some of the kids were in the room, and there was some scene that we didn't remember. When you watch old movies with your kids, you're like, wow, I didn't remember it being this way. But it was one of those things, and there was a little bit of nudity. It wasn't even explicit at all. And the mother of the son, he was probably 10 years old. She clapped her hands over his eyes after the scene had ended, and she clapped her hands over his eyes as if I think she was trying to signal to him that wasn't okay. But in my mind, I was watching thinking, all you did was give him plenty of time to reimagine that image. The last thing he saw, now all he sees is your fingers, and he knows that it's this big, heavy thing.
Yeah.
So you're creating this weird sense of what is and isn't okay. That seems, that's when I decided, okay, well, clearly that version is not going to work for us.
Yeah.
We have to find a way
you're alluding to, you're giving more power to the narrative than it deserves, right? When you react in that way, when your anxiety is front and center, then the kids know that, and that, heightens the whole experience instead of normalizing it and not having it be such a big deal.
So especially if you believe sexuality and pornography is a monster, why feed the monster?
Right.
It doesn't make sense.
Right.
I mean, even if you feel like it's not that big a deal, you still wouldn't elevate the negative aspects. You wouldn't hyper focus on the things that are going to cause trouble. You would take it into broader context and, put it in place. It just seems to be, I don't know. I don't want to seem arrogant. I don't understand why people, why is it our inclination to parent in a way that if you were watching, say, a TV show and a reality show or something, and you're watching this character and that interaction, you think, oh, that's not going to work. I think that all the time when I react badly with my kids, I'm thinking back about the day, I'm like, oh, anybody could have seen that was a stupid move. That was bad energy. There's no way that could possibly have worked. And I feel like that's the approach that conservative culture has embraced. From a distance, they'd be like, well, of course that won't work. But they're pushing. If we push harder, it's not working yet, so we better push harder.
Right.
Where else in life do we do that kind of stuff?
It takes me back to Marriage and Family Therapy 101. One of the first things they told us, it's very typical of humans, is that when something doesn't work, we do it louder. That's kind of our first reaction, regardless of what that topic is. We just do it louder. And so helping people, find different ways versus getting louder is one of the big things we're trying to do in therapy services. But even, I just developed an online course on parental anxiety. And I do think that you're right. It's not because people are stupid. I think that, first of all, when you're raised in a fear-driven system, which I do think, even outside of Mormonism, we come from, puritanical America, and we have issues even that other countries don't necessarily have around sexuality. We still don't have comprehensive sexual education in the United States, things like that. So I think fear, although it's ineffective, is very powerful. And I think most of us probably grew up in fear-based systems ourselves when it came to sexuality. And so we haven't really been offered the skills necessary. You're mentioning a lot of times that you're having to pause, recalibrate, be thoughtful, be mindful. That takes a lot of work. And it's great that you're able to do that. That comes a lot more difficult to a lot of people. And so I think it is very natural. I guess I just want to normalize for people out there that it's very natural that we would use fear when it's such a primitive feeling and it can be so strong. And even in your best moments, your IQ lowers when you're afraid. And so you might have all these intellectually great ideas about how easy, how you feel like you want to raise your kids. But in those moments when your fear is triggered and when you're really anxious for something that your kids are seeing on TV, or, like that mom that you say that clapped her hands over her son's eyes, that's a fear response, a protective response. And it's hard when actually protecting our children goes against the grain of what we were offered, right? And so we have to actually swim upstream a little bit and not just go with the flow. So that's a task. That's hard. And I think that's the task that most of us as parents are in, just because most of us grew up in these systems where it was fear-based.
And there's no immediate result in parenting, right? It's not as if a computer program you hit compile and it works or it doesn't work. Right. With parenting, we're trying it and we feel remarkably insecure all the time. Every decision I make, I feel insecure about. I just hope that it works, and I hope that I'm not at least doing damage. So it certainly makes sense. Especially we have different thresholds, I guess. So there are certain topics and certain interactions where I'm far more likely to revert to fear instead of, maybe taking a longer view, taking time to take a breath. This is just one that we thought so much about that maybe it comes more easily.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and I appreciate that you're offering that example, that it does take time. It's not something that you can just go really quickly and think you're going to have a parenting strategy around this. You have to actually develop a parenting strategy around, I think, sexual education for sure. Another thing that you mentioned that I really liked is this kind of storyline where, if you saw a car show and, it'd be very easy to ask your parents, oh, can you really, if you press the brakes, or can you really jump over the river, and would your car really make it? It'd be pretty easy, right, for a kid to ask questions that had to do with driving. But far less likely, we make it far less likely that a kid is going to necessarily say, hey, I was looking at, a pornographic show last night and they were in this position, or, the man, ejaculated in her face, and girls like that, or is that something I should do, or should I try that? Do you guys do that in your bedroom? And that's not, and you made that point in conjunction also with the idea that, for example, with driving, kids, even though they're not driving themselves, they're watching people drive. They're in the car with you, right? So they have a lot of experience knowing that when they start driving, it's much easier to get into the driver's seat when you've been in the passenger seat for so long. And that's just not something that happens with sexuality. It's not like we're sexual with our kids, obviously, for good reason. And so they might see a few things, through media. And of course, that's one of the problems with pornography, is if that's all they're seeing, then there's a lot of unrealistic expectations. And even, I would say, better media outlets are still not super realistic. Even if you're not showing nude body parts, it's not like the romance rhetoric on shows is super realistic. So then the kids don't have this kind of experience to back them up. So that's two different things. So experience, and also this idea of being able to ask questions. So you want to talk a little bit about your thoughts about those things?
I think that my wife and I are at least, we do a better job at this conversation than some people, I think. I still feel like we have no idea what we're doing. And I feel like we have no idea of knowing really whether or not our conversation is productive or if we handle it well or not. It is still really awkward. Like the examples you gave, you went up in intensity, as you said, do girls like that? Should I do that? Do you do that? Right?
Yeah.
Those are three questions that get very, very close to, I'm going to back up and put my dad gloves back on and, parent as if they were little objects in my world instead of parenting as if there were people in my world. Because as the questions get harder, I mean, I'm not a sex therapist. They ask questions like that, I might cough and blush and feel like, oh, geez,
I'm a sex therapist and I still cough and blush and my own kids.
I hope that they are likely to understand they could ask the question. But still, I mean, it really is, there's so many ideas that would run through your head as a parent if your son comes to you and says, ask those questions, right? I hope I would have the inclination to answer the question and deal with him but I might freak out about like, you did what? How did, like internet filtering, all these things would pop through my mind. Like, how is this happening? And that'd be the fear again. And fear always comes first. So if I had the wherewithal to come around, that would be great. But parenting is a trick. Even if you have great intentions and even if you thought it through in advance and have something you consider to be a strategy.
Yeah, no, I think that's, I think it's hard to talk to parents about sexuality anyway, even if you have a sex positive home, because there's something about sexuality that's somewhat private. And I don't know if you notice this with your kids, but my kids started like being shy about showing their bodies somewhere between like 6 and 10, depending on the kid. That kind of happened naturally, where they go streaking through the house, naked and think that's really fun, at 3. They're not doing that at 12. And not because we didn't tell them to do that. That just kind of seems natural that people get private as they grow more aware of self. And so I think, and sexuality is something private. And in fact, the World Health Organization has that even as one of its basic human sexual rights, the right to privacy. And of course, parents have the right to privacy as well. You don't need to be disclosing, details of your sex life with your children to be good sexual educators. And I think a lot of it has to do with personality. So I've got one kid who probably would ask those questions quite unabashedly. And I've got, other kids who even when I, want to sit down and share a book or a resource, like, they go red and, oh, mom, and rolling their eyes and putting pillows over their faces. It's the last thing they want to do is have a chat about sexuality. So that creates its own issues, right? As kids who are proactive and will ask questions, and then having to be a little bit more strategic with those who don't, and making sure they have good information as well. One of the things that I think is important to talk about with pornography is that it's kind of like the two-sided coin. On the one hand, it's a form of entertainment. And I think you do a really good job of pointing that out. It's not realistic. You even mentioned something like, it's a script and there's times that they pause and splice the videos together, so I mean, it's a movie, so it's not going to be realistic. And at the same time, there are parts of any type of human experience that you watch that are going to be enjoyable for some and not enjoyable for others. So even something that we may see as, again, that word objectifying, like ejaculating in somebody's face, well, believe it or not, there's women who like that and women who don't. There's men who like doing that, men who don't like doing that. And so being able to just kind of say something along the lines of, part of your job when you get to be a grown-up and have a sexual partner is going to be an ongoing journey of figuring out what you like and what you don't like. And you might be influenced by things other people do, and you might try something out because you've seen it, but it doesn't necessarily mean that's going to go well, and it may go fantastic. So that's yet to be determined. And of course, big pieces of that going well, if you're going to try something like that, is consent and communication and, kind of the 6 principles of sexual health, which that's what I'm doing on this show as well with Doug Braun-Harvey. So anybody who's interested in those episodes, those are really great. So yeah, it doesn't have to be a yes or no, right? Or an either or this binary that I think oftentimes we put these types of issues in, like it's all bad or it's all good.
Right. And when you have a dichotomy like that, it's almost always fake. It doesn't actually exist. And the question is, well, who benefits, right? I mean, somebody, if you actually buy into the black and white reasoning, somebody's benefiting from that. And it probably is not you. So I try to get my kid, and that's everywhere. Like there's so many false dichotomies out there. I have a question for you, Natasha.
Yeah.
About
love it.
Like this may or may not be in response to a question that I fielded from one of my kids. So if porn is entertainment and scripted and produced and everything, what about the growing area of porn that is not at all professional? It's just people and or a person with a camera.
Yeah. In fact, this is one of this is a fascinating topic, right? Is as people become less inhibited and more willing to take sexual risks and, kind of backlashing against the sexual shame rhetoric, right? Which, again, it's not just a Mormon issue. Many people grow up with sexual shame. We are finding that people enjoy their voyeuristic or exhibitionist sides of themselves and are more than happy to engage in what is called amateur porn, right? And so they'll videotape themselves and they'll put it up, and it's consensual. That's couples or partnerships. Many of them are married that are doing this type of thing. And it's so interesting too, because it's actually, I think, one of the drivers towards the porn industry having to make some changes, because I think it's so easy to access free material these days that it's getting harder and harder for people to pay for things. So that is making the porn industry have to up its game a little bit. And so we are seeing some interesting developments. For example, there's a lot more pornography that's coming out with like feminist values, so it's not just so much about women being objectified and more traditional themes. Pornhub, I think, is coming up with sexual education, like sexual education sites, so that because, to field some of these criticisms that pornography is used as an educator of teens, although again, that's not Pornhub's responsibility. That's, I think, our schools and parents' responsibilities. But it's interesting to see kind of the game having to be upped because of the competition, I think, that amateur porn is doing. So again, it may not fall into our value system to engage in something like that or to watch things like that. And yet when your kids are asking about it or when you want to talk to people about it, I think this idea of voyeurism, which means I like to watch, and exhibitionism, which means I like to be watched, those are human tendencies that are as old as you can go, that people have enjoyed those types of sexual, erotic type of energies. And people will use technology to, I think it's Marty Klein who says, anytime you come up with anything technological, one of the first places it goes is sexual. So any new technology, people will figure out how to use it in a sexual way. And so selfies and Facebook Lives and all these things where people can show what they're doing can also come with a sexual component. And we see that with sexting and, dick pics and all these things that, you hear about. And I think it's very important to talk to teens about, because they themselves in their own circles might be doing some of these things. And some of these things might be fun for them and going well. At the same time, there's huge risk for teenagers that those types of, messages or videos, if they are sent like anything else, will be made more public than they ever assumed. So I think that's a very important conversation to be having with teenagers, is once you send it to somebody, even if you think it's private, like your boyfriend or girlfriend, you really have zero control as to whether or not they're going to share that with somebody else. Right. Even if it's not current, like currently maybe we love each other and we're totally fine with each other. 6 months from now, we just had a horrible breakup. There's revenge issues. Now I'm going to show everybody this thing that's going to embarrass you. There's emotional bullying. There's cyberbullying. And unfortunately for some kids, because this is so overwhelming, right? I mean, their brains aren't fully developed. That doesn't happen till 26. It can be to the point where we have, suicides happen over things like cyberbullying and sexual information going awry on the internet. So again, there's a two-sided coin. Adults who kind of understand what they're getting themselves into, if they want to take those risks of losing their anonymity in that way, that's kind of their choice. Some people find that arousing. Again, are the sexual principles being followed? Is there consent? Is there mutual pleasure? Is there shared values between those people? Those are the things that matter. When you're 15, 16, maybe you're not quite mature to make those decisions. You don't really understand the ramifications of those decisions. These are the guidelines. These are the reasons why we would encourage you not to do those things at this particular time of your life. These are our values as to why we may feel, that that's not appropriate. Those are the kinds of conversations I would hope we'd be having. Does that answer your question?
Yeah. It helps add context to it. Yeah.
Yeah, amateur porn. Everybody's doing it. See seems to be the new slogan. But yeah, so let's see. We're kind of getting to the end. And I noticed too that you yourself share some of your values in this, like some of your concerns with the porn industry and things like that. I always think it's much more effective to give kids reasons versus this is just bad, or this is just sinful, or this is just, God would disapprove of this. Those are all kind of moral overlays, and not that you can't say things like that if that's part of your value system, but I think they fall somewhat hollow if that's all you're offering. So I think it's important, kind of like you said, even your 14-year-old is pretty savvy. Like, come on, Dad, give me the information. What are you talking about? Kids are growing up in the information age. They can look up things very quickly to counter your positions. So, having good research that you've thought through and been able to talk about is really important. The whole porn industry is objective, is a difficult one. It's a complicated one because there are many, many people who want those kinds of jobs and are very comfortable with those kinds of jobs, find those kinds of jobs empowering. There's also abuses that happen in that industry. And that's true really of any industry, right? So I try to make that point as well when we underpay people for work they do, or, would prefer to give a job to 2 part-time people so that we can avoid giving them benefits versus, a full-time position that's more life supporting. I mean, there's all kinds of concerns with industry and money and power differentials. And that happens in any type of setting where there's going to be services rendered, right? So it's not just, I think sometimes it's easy to say, oh, the porn industry just takes advantage of people, but I think it's a little bit more complex than that.
Sure, it is. I think if there were a lot of people banging on the drum, whatever industry that was, if they were picking on an industry, instead of making it like that industry itself is evil or scary, I would take the same approach. Say, okay, well, it's fine if you object to, I don't know, whatever business, but object for a reason that doesn't involve your reptile brain. Like, there's no reason. There's no reason to. That's that part of our brain that triggers fear. It's not wired to help us make good choices long term. It's a keep yourself alive in the minute, in the instant. So whether we're talking about, I don't know, like sewing machine manufacturers or something like that, like, sure, there's probably exploitation that happens in factories and things like that too. So talk about the productive, real, reasoned reasons to object to the industry, and not so much the you're going to go to hell or you'll be an addict. That kind of rhetoric just seems like it's not productive.
Yeah.
I try to avoid, when I'm parenting, I try to avoid right and wrong and talk all the time about productive or unproductive. Because
I like that. Yes.
Whatever it is my kids want to do, whatever it is they feel like is going to make them feel alive and like feel glad that they were here, I want to help them get there. I'm not concerned by whether people in one church or another think that their choices are, A-level choices or C-level choices. I want to help them get to where they want to be. And that's way easier if I just say productive, unproductive, because when their goals change, so can their actions. You don't have to like reinvent a whole new moral system, ethical system. You can just go with them as they grow.
I love that. And that's a good point to end on, is this language that we choose. So, unproductive, productive, satisfying, non-satisfying, things that enhance your life, edify. Are you finding this to damage or, hurt you in some way versus whether or not it's sinful? So being critical thinkers, right, about how they navigate their world. And even if they do make quote unquote mistakes, how do we frame that in the sense of learning opportunities? What did you learn about yourself through that experience? How do you want to go forward, knowing the information you have now from that experience versus, again, just looking at it from this perspective of, oh my goodness, you're broken or you have sinned or, not that, I think that the repentance process, for example, in Mormonism can be very helpful for people, but it really depends on the context. So if it comes from this place of I'm broken and a problem and I need to be fixed, that's a lot less helpful than I have an issue that I'd like to work through and have better ideas of how to conduct myself in the future, and what did this mean for me or for others? Did I hurt others in this process? Did I hurt myself, et cetera? There's just a much more rich dialogue depending on the language we choose. So I think that's a wonderful invitation. Yeah. Any closing thoughts as far as what this piece meant? Do you feel like your kids have a propensity to want to talk to you about these kinds of things, or have you noticed any positive? Like you said, it's hard to know with parenting, right? Because it's never done. So, but do you or your wife feel like taking this approach has had positive effects up until now?
I feel like, without any expectation of what it would actually bring about. I mean, I wrote this letter for my son legitimately and decided to share it. It's not like I wrote it for the internet and then decided, oh, by the way, I'm a parent. I guess I should parent.
Right.
So it has been useful to have the conversation in the home. Now with 3 of my kids have read and now listened to this piece. What's been interesting is not so much the conversations we had, which are about the same. The amount of openness we have has been good, but we had some conversations specifically about it. Longer term, it seems like my kids knowing that we put this kind of thought and time into parenting, and that we're willing to question assumptions that are pretty pervasive in the culture, has created in them, I think they trust us more than average. So on other topics completely unrelated, I think they're more willing to, after the emotion subsides, come back and say, okay, I was upset before, but let's talk some more about, what's going on here. I don't think we're excellent parents, but I think it has helped create the situation where my kids understand that we're parenting on purpose and that we're going to make mistakes, and that we care enough to really think. When we put our foot down about something, it's not because we're embarrassed because the neighbors are going to think a certain thing. It's because this feels important. And that has helped reset our relationship in some ways. And my older kids actually, I think they have a sort of sense of pride that, oh, have you seen my dad? My dad wrote this thing. And, in some ways, maybe like they agree, or they like being a contrarian a little bit. Like I'm kind of edgy because my dad wrote this thing that's not like what you think about porn or something. But that's been interesting to see that. I think it's helped connect us. Anytime we do something like this, where it feels like this was a lot of effort for the child, it seems like it helps connect.
Yeah, that's great. That's so good to hear. Well, that can be our new slogan for the week, or put on your bumper stickers, parenting on purpose. I love that. So yeah, thank you so much for your time, Paul. I've really enjoyed this interview. I've so enjoyed this piece. I continue to share it all the time as a resource for parents. And I hope that as people listen to this, that they'll be able to share it with friends and family as well. So really great job, and so glad that you've had the success you've had with it.
Oh, thanks. I hope it's helpful.
Yeah, for sure.
We took the long road home, turned minutes into miles, and as the evening traveled on, the sunset bathed your smile. We stopped beneath the desert stars, wrapped in each other's arms. Was as simple as I love you, an ordinary, extraordinary truth.
It's been a long road here, a trail with tears, pain and sorrow too.
But through every storm we traveled on, like lovers do. And if if sometimes we fell apart, we always came back home. Was as simple as I love you, an ordinary, extraordinary truth. Some people say love is blind and forever is too long. But I see your eyes in every sunrise. Can't imagine life alone. Let's take the long road on together until we're gone. Want you by my side till the day I die and into the beyond. It's as simple as our love is. That's how I wanna go, all wrapped up in the arms of our extraordinary, it's nothing ordinary love. Ordinary. No, it's extraordinary.